We're continuing our series today on the introduction to apologetics. In this episode, we're going to move into the next major section of the series where we'll be reviewing the evidence for Christian theism. So it's time to consider the rational case that can be made for Christianity. If you've been following along in this series, you'll remember that we're pursuing a general approach that's been called the classical method of apologetics. The classical method today has three general levels or steps that build on each other in the effort to present a reasonable case for Christian faith. And at this point in the series, we've already surveyed two of these levels. The first is the foundational level, where we looked at some preliminary philosophical issues related to the nature of truth and to the nature of science. We saw that this step was necessary to clear up some common confusions and mistakes in thinking that prevent many people from even considering the rational case that can be made for Christianity. We then had an extended look at the second step of the classical method. Here we reviewed a sampling of arguments for theism. Theism, if you recall, being the claim that there exists a creator God responsible for the existence of everything outside of himself. We looked at arguments of the cosmological, teleological, and moral variety. And these arguments, if sound, establish the reasonableness of belief in God. Now, I say that we sampled arguments here because there are many more arguments that have been offered for God's existence that we just did not have time to look at, so just be aware of that. Recall that in a previous episode in this series, we said that there were three general ways to think about God and reality, or three basic philosophical views about ultimate reality. There's theism, which says that God creates all. There's atheism, which says that there's no God at all. And then there's pantheism, which says that God is all. If the arguments for theism that we've looked at are sound, then we're now in a position to rule out two of these three general options. And as we saw, several of the arguments, when philosophically unpacked, lead to a single creator God who's distinct from creation and who's also in some sense personal. That is, there's a God who is endowed with intellect and will. If God exists, well, atheism is obviously false. And if God is distinct from creation and in some sense personal, then pantheism is also false. That leaves theism as the only remaining option. Of course, if theism is true, then it seems that we must be open to the possibility of both miracles and divine revelation. That is, we have to be open to there being special acts of God in the world and a special communication from God to us. But theism, as we've seen, comes in several varieties. There are three great monotheistic faiths that all claim special revelation from God, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So this brings us to the final step in the classical method of apologetics, where a rational case is made for the truth of Christian theism in particular. And at this stage, we want to show that it is in fact the Christian God who exists and has made himself known to us in a special way. So here we're going to argue that Christianity is the true form of theism. The basic claim of Christianity is that this personal creator God has, in fact, made himself known in a deliberate and special way to humanity at various times and in various places throughout history. The record of that revelation is what Christians call Scripture, or more commonly just the Bible. Interestingly, all three of the major monotheistic religions consider the Bible to be divine revelation in part or in whole and in some sense. Jews and Christians share the belief that the Old Testament, as it's referred to in the Christian Bible, is divine revelation, and Muslims too believe that parts of the Old and New Testaments were in some way divinely revealed, though of course in a way that's both subordinate and inferior to the Quran. It is for this reason that the three great monotheistic religions of the world are often referred to as the Abrahamic religions. Abraham, of course, being a prominent figure in the Christian Old Testament and important to all three religions. What ultimately distinguishes Christianity from both Islam and Judaism is the uniquely Christian claim that God has decisively revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ. The central claim of Christian theism is the incarnation, which the Gospel of John describes this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The incarnation is at the very heart of Christianity. It is the center, it's the ground, it's the foundation of Christian belief. Christians are Christians because of Christ. Christianity itself stands or falls with Jesus. So when evaluating the truth of Christian theism, it really all comes down to Christ. If Jesus is who he says he is, then Christianity is true. If Jesus was not who he said he was, then Christianity is false. It's really that simple. Jesus claimed to be God revealed in human form. He claimed to represent God, to speak for God, to act on God's behalf. And Jesus didn't just merely claim to be God. He didn't just merely claim divine authority. I mean, plenty of people have done that throughout history. What makes Jesus unique is that he provided proof and evidence, or signs, as John calls them in his gospel, that he was, in actual fact, the revelation of God as man. There are several lines of evidence that were given by Christ while he was on the earth to substantiate and confirm the truthfulness of his claims. Jesus fulfilled prophecies, and thereby he showed himself to be the long-awaited Messiah foretold by the prophets of Israel. Jesus exercised authority over demons. He had authority over the spiritual realm and the power of darkness. And Jesus performed miracles. He demonstrated supernatural ability by healing physical diseases and ailments and by wielding power over nature. Of course, the single greatest proof and the final testament to the claims of Christ is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus predicted that he would be killed for his claims and that 3 days later, God would raise him from the dead, alive from the grave. And as I say, Christianity stands or falls with Christ. And since the claims of Christ finally rest on his resurrection, it can be said that Christianity itself rises or falls with the resurrection. The Apostle Paul himself says this in a letter to the Corinthian church. He says, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain, and your faith is vain. Christianity, then, is a historically grounded faith. Christianity rests on public events, on real events in history. The historic grounding of the Christian faith makes it unique among the world's religions. Unlike so many other religious movements and religions that are founded on the private revelations of a prophet or the body of teachings of a guru that can be neither verified nor falsified, Christianity is entirely based on certain events that took place in the life of a certain man who lived in a certain region of the Middle East just 30 lifetimes ago. Again, the central Christian claim is that God became man and walked among us in a particular place. We know exactly where, and at a particular time in history. We know within a handful of years exactly when. And this is a matter of public record. It's a matter of history. And as such, it can be subjected, at least in principle, to a historical analysis and to the historical method, and is therefore historically verifiable or falsifiable. So Christianity rests on a foundation of historical facts, and its truth is bound up with the truth of those historical facts. The primary historical witness to the facts of history surrounding the revelation of God in Christ is what is called in the Christian Bible the New Testament. It's important to understand from the outset what the New Testament is. It's a mistake to think of the New Testament as a book. For one thing, books as we know them today, which consist of individual pages bound together, did not exist at this time in history. Instead, what you had were individual handwritten scrolls of varying length. These scrolls could be really long. The Gospel of Matthew, for example, would have consisted in a scroll that was some 33 feet long. Originally, there wasn't some religious or holy book that was called the New Testament going around in the first century. Instead, there were 27 individual scrolls that were circulating and that were written by 9 or 10 different authors, depending on the identity of the author of the book of Revelation. It's important to underscore this fact because the authors of the documents that would become the New Testament wrote independently of one another, and the scrolls that they penned were circulated separately from each other. And it wasn't until the 2nd century that these writings began to be collected together. So that what we now call the New Testament originally consisted in just a bunch of independent documents that were circulating in the 1st century that recorded and bore testimony to certain events, many of which took place within the author's lifetimes. The New Testament, properly understood then, is not just one early source for the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It's actually a collection of early sources. These early Christian documents claim to contain both direct and indirect eyewitness testimony about Christ. Early Christian tradition tells us that 2 of the Gospels were written by apostles who followed Jesus during his ministry, and all but perhaps 2 of the epistles were written by authors who had encountered the risen Jesus. There's also indirect eyewitness testimony in the New Testament. And here I'm thinking about the Gospel of Mark, which is traditionally believed to be based on the testimony of Peter, and the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, which were both written by Luke, who was not himself an eyewitness of Christ, but whose works were based on the testimony of those who were. So if we're going to make a rational case for the truth of Christian theism, we need to provide reasons to believe in the testimony of the New Testament regarding the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So in the coming episodes, we'll be seeking to answer the following questions. First, do we have accurate copies of the New Testament? Obviously, the question of the truth of what the New Testament claims is pointless unless we can first be confident that our copies of it are faithful reflections of the originals. Then we want to ask, is the New Testament historically trustworthy and reliable? And here we'll seek reasons for thinking that the New Testament represents a credible witness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and the rise of the early Jesus movement. And finally, we want to know if there's evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And here we'll review the historical case that can be made for the historicity of the resurrection. But before turning to these questions, let me just say something as a general response to so much of the skepticism that's directed at the New Testament from a secular perspective today. Without question, the driving force behind the skepticism over New Testament reliability and the resurrection of Jesus is the presumption of scientific naturalism. Both the rise of skeptical biblical criticism of the 19th century in Germany and the hypercritical biblical scholarship today begin from the assumption of anti-supernaturalism. It goes without saying that if the New Testament text is approached from a philosophical presupposition that rules out from the start the legitimacy of considering miracle claims as true or factual, well, then the New Testament can only be viewed from a highly skeptical perspective. The New Testament is, after all, filled with claims of the miraculous. However, as we've seen in the course of this series, there are lots of good reasons to think that God in fact exists and that scientific naturalism is in fact false. But as I've said before, if God exists, then miracles are possible. And if miracles are possible, then the anti-supernaturalism behind so much of the secular skeptical approach to the New Testament is unjustified and it's misguided. This is one of the reasons I like the classical method of apologetics. The formal argument for Christian theism on this model happens only after one has argued for theism. If we've made it this far, then criticisms of the New Testament that are based on a rejection of the miraculous will appear very weak indeed. It seems to me that apart from the anti-supernatural bias, there's just no good reason to approach the text of the New Testament from a skeptical stance that pronounces the New Testament guilty of being historically unreliable until proven innocent and historically reliable. I think there are 2 things that will be abundantly clear to any honest and open reader of the New Testament. The first is that the writers of the New Testament intended to report, to relate, to explain events that actually took place in the life of Jesus and in the early Jesus movement. And second, that the writers of the New Testament really believed what they were saying. And this, of course, has been the conclusion of billions of readers of the New Testament around the world over the last 2,000 years.